Maybe you've traveled to Britain and exchanged your American dollars for British pounds. You may have wondered why you get less British pounds for each American dollar that you change. If so, you've experienced exchange rates in action. But do you understand how they work? You've probably heard the financial reporter on the nightly news say something like, "The dollar fell against the yen today." But do you know what that means? In this video, we'll tell you what exchange rates are and explain some of the factors that can affect the value of currency in countries around the world. National currencies are vitally important to the way modern economies operate. They allow us to consistently express the value of an item across borders of countries, oceans, and cultures. We need exchange rates because we buy products and services in the seller's currency, whether that is due to travel tourism, investment, or foreign trade. The exchange rate is simply the cost of one form of currency in another form of currency. In other words, if you exchange one Swiss franc for 80 Japanese yen, you really just purchased a different form of money. There are various systems that determine a currency's exchange rate. Historically, governments entrusted the gold standard system as a way to formalize exchange rates. Under this system, all currency represented a real amount of gold held in a vault by that government. However, the system was flawed because countries needed to hold large gold reserves in order to keep up with the volatile nature of supply and demand for currency. Nowadays, there are three main systems used to determine a currency's exchange rate: the free-floating, fixed, and managed exchange rate systems. A free-floating exchange rate is set by the foreign exchange market through supply and demand for that particular currency relative to other currencies. In other words, a currency is worth whatever buyers are willing to pay for it and will be affected from day to day by changes in trade through exports and imports, speculation, and other factors such as price level, interest rates, and political situations in countries. For example, the exchange rate for the Chinese yuan will increase and you will get fewer yuan for your dollar if demand for the yuan increases because of greater demand, through imports, for instance. For Chinese goods, simultaneously, the dollar will depreciate or fall in value as more dollars have been sold or supplied to the market. Generally, countries with mature, stable economic markets will use a floating system. Virtually every major nation uses this system, including the US, Canada, and Great Britain. Floating exchange rates are considered more efficient because the market will automatically correct the rate to reflect inflation and other economic forces. The floating system isn't perfect, though. If a country's economy suffers from instability, a floating system will discourage investment due to uncertainty about possible returns. Investors could fall victim to wild swings in the exchange rates as well as disastrous inflation. The alternative system is a pegged or fixed exchange rate system. This is where the exchange rate is set and artificially maintained by the government. The rate will be pegged to some other country's currency, usually the US dollar, and will not fluctuate from day to day. A government has to work to keep their pegged rates stable. Their national bank must hold large reserves of foreign currency to mitigate changes in supply and demand. If a sudden demand for a currency were to drive up the exchange rate, the national bank would have to release enough of that currency into the market to meet the demand. They can also buy up currency if low demand is lowering exchange rates. Countries that have immature, potentially unstable economies usually use a pegged system. Developing nations can use a system to prevent out-of-control inflation to keep its products cheap and foreign products expensive, both of which are good for the balance of trade. This is why China has been criticized because it has kept its currency value artificially low in order to make exports cheaper and maintain a favorable trade balance. In reality, few exchange rate systems are 100% floating or 100% pegged. Countries using a pegged rate can avoid market panics and inflationary disasters by using a managed floating exchange rate. They peg their rate to the US dollar, and that rate doesn't fluctuate from day to day. However, the government periodically reviews their peg and makes minor adjustments to keep it in line with the true market value. This is similar to the semi-fixed exchange rate system, which differs by the fact that the interest rate is permitted to move between bands of fluctuation, but is ultimately given a specific target, which is the dominant aim for economic policy making through interest rate. Floating systems aren't really left to the mercy of market forces either. Governments using floating exchange rates make changes to their national economic policy that can affect exchange rates directly or indirectly. Tax cuts, changes to the national interest rate, and import tariffs can all change the value of a nation's currency, even though the value technically floats. The next time you cross a border and trade your money for that of another country, remember that economic forces across the world help determine that exchange rate. In fact, when you exchange currencies, you're one of those economic forces. You're helping to set the exchange rate too. Got a question that you want us to simply explain? Ask us in the comments.